I'm Tom Clays, President of the Board of the Santa Monica Conservancy, and I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon for the second of our 3 fall lectures. Some of you may be familiar with the Conservancy's mission, but for those of you that are not, the Conservancy is a historic preservation organization, much like the LA Conservancy or the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We're an educational and advocacy group that focuses on Santa Monica and the immediately surrounding area. Through our efforts for the last 18 years, we've become the leading voice in the community for embracing historic preservation and adaptive reuse while celebrating all our historic communities and their memories. We want to thank our sponsor, Redcar, and Jim Jacobson, its owner, for making this fall lecture series possible. Redcar is a local firm that invests in urban commercial real estate in Los Angeles, specializing in adaptive reuse and redevelopment with a commitment to sustainable, ethical, and responsible investment. With that, I want to turn the program over to Libby Motika. Thank you.
This is the second lecture in our series that focuses on the communities whose history and culture make up a vital piece of the mosaic we call Santa Monica. Our lecture tonight focuses on the erased history of Belmar and the other forgotten African-American communities that once flourished in South Santa Monica from the 19th to the mid-20th century. Historian Alison Rose Jefferson and social practice artist April Banks will talk about these neighborhoods and the ambitious project called Belmar History and Art. The project will be located on the site of the original neighborhoods that is now adjacent to the Santa Monica Civic and will include historic and artistic displays around the park perimeter. Allison will offer an illustrated view of the neighborhood and the residents, businesses, and visitors whose stories underpin the educational mission of the project. April will talk about the artworks, including her own Resurrection in 4 Stanzas, a set of red frame structures representing 4 different sections of a typical shotgun house. Allison holds a Ph.D. in history and a master's in heritage conservation. She specializes in reconstructing underrepresented stories of the African-American experience. Her recent book, Living the California Dream, chronicles Black leisure sites during the Jim Crow era. April holds a bachelor's in architecture and a master's degree in environmental design. Her career has straddled several areas: conceptual art, exhibition design, and social practice that seeks to amplify and preserve lesser-known stories. Before we get started, before I present the speakers, I'd like to remind you in the audience that you can ask questions throughout the talk by using your Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our featured guests will be happy to answer them after the presentation. And now please welcome Alison Rose Jefferson, who will be followed by April Banks. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Nice to be with you today. Okay, so the Belmar History and Art Project originated at a California Coastal Commission meeting in Los Angeles in March 2019, where I seized the opportunity I saw to suggest that the Santa Monica officials be asked to support development of an educational and interpretive program to teach the public about the erased history of some of the earliest African-American residents who lived and contributed to making Santa Monica a vibrant and unique place from the 1900s to the 1960s in the beach neighborhoods south of Interstate 10 freeway as a construction permit condition for the new Belmar Park, it's now called the new historic Belmar Park at 4th and Pico. I had been invited to this meeting to help set the tone with a presentation on the African American experience in Southern California when the commission was to vote to approve its landmark environmental justice policy for social equity and inclusion. The commissioners liked my idea. They saw it as an action to set in motion the strategies they wanted to implement in their new mandate to help ensure equitable coastal access for marginalized communities. Santa Monica officials found funding to develop this programming that became attached to the park's construction and invited me to work on it. This is the first applied history and art project undertaken by the city. In less than a year, artist April Banks, myself, and other contributors produced this multifaceted project you are learning about today. As the project historian, I developed an essay around this specific history called Reconstruction and Reclamation, the Erased African American Experience from Santa Monica's History, which joins my book, Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era, to underpin the Belmar Art and History Project. The programming includes an outdoor exhibition installation of 16 panels, which I created the content for, and a large sculpture created by April Banks that will be installed at the new park in the next few months. I developed with UCLA colleagues and master public school teachers K through 12 curriculum to meet the California State History Social Science Framework and Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Guidelines. These lessons, along with the new African American history essay I've written, will be available for all to review and use soon on the project website, along with educational resources and inspirational materials and other project programming features, such as a high school artwork project. Teacher workshops to introduce the curriculum for use in the Santa Monica and Los Angeles school districts, among others, will happen soon. Now, a little bit about the history of the neighborhoods. The first African Americans settled in Santa Monica in the late 19th century, joining a multi-ethnic community that included whites and people of color, as well as immigrants of many national backgrounds in building the new city. Most African Americans migrated from southern states, attracted by the climate, possibilities of new life opportunities, and escape from Jim Crow white supremacy, anti-Black restrictions, and racial injustice. Seduced by the sand and surf resort town offerings, the early African American pioneers joined other migrants to the region in seeking their California and American dreams. The city of Santa Monica has the oldest African American settlement of any Pacific Rim city in the region. African Americans living, among other groups, from the 1900s to the 1950s in residential clusters in the neighborhoods of, lived in the neighborhoods of the Ocean Park district, radiating out around Phillips Chapel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church at 4th and Bay Streets, at the area that was called the Belmar Triangle, where the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium and the new historic Belmar Park and the LA County Courthouse are today located north of Pico, between 4th and Main Streets, and in the streets north of Santa Monica High School, east of 4th Street. Until the World War II years and the following decades, most of these early pioneers worked in domestic and service employment, while a few were small business entrepreneurs. All had faith in the promise of upward mobility. Education education for their children was important. They were people who saved their money, and as soon as they could, they bought a home and sometimes other real estate. They were strivers and joiners and civil rights leaders of the era. They were strivers and joiners and civil rights leaders of the era, not unlike those African Americans who moved to other parts of the West during the early decades of the 20th century. Like their counterparts all over the United States, they tirelessly challenged oppression and discrimination in Santa Monica to dismantle racial barriers when California civil rights laws were which were passed as early as 1893, were not enforced. Many of the African American community members in these neighborhoods attended Phillips Chapel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, which opened in its own building in 1909 and was Santa Monica's first African American spiritual and institutional structure. It was also the denomination's first church west of Texas. The 11 stained glass windows of the church commemorate pioneering African American families in the city who were members. In 2005, based on my research and leadership efforts, Phillips Chapel was designated as a City of Santa Monica landmark for its cultural significance. The first minister of Phillips Chapel was the Reverend James A. Stout, who migrated with his family from Texas to Santa Monica. The Stouts, along with other extended family members, made Santa Monica their permanent home. Christine Lawson, the Stouts' granddaughter, and her children and her grandchildren and her new great-grandchild continue to make Santa Monica their home in the Ocean Park neighborhood. Christine's father was civically active and became the second African American who served on Santa Monica City Council from 1973 to 1975. Sometime when you get a chance to go back to City Hall again, check out his photograph in the lobby. The pioneering Black-owned enterprise La Bonita opened around 1924 on Belmar Place, a street that ran north and south between Pico and Main Street, where the Civic Auditorium is today. It provided African Americans and other marginalized people with a place to change into their bathing suits, rent a guest room, or have some refreshments. Through a succession of owners and different business configurations, La Bonita lasted until the 1950s, when the construction of the Civic Auditorium and the LA County Courthouse razed the establishment, caused the establishment to be razed. This and other businesses in the area provided services and accommodations to African Americans from Santa Monica and beyond, particularly when they came to enjoy the Pacific Ocean a few blocks away. This and other ventures, including a few important unsuccessful attempts at beach area business development, overlap the rise of Black beach culture and residency to support a deepened community life and an African-American made place in Santa Monica and the Bay Cities. Down the hill from the Belmar area and Phillips Chapel was the beach which became the most popular with African Americans in Santa Monica and those visiting from the Los Angeles region and beyond during the Jim Crow era from the 1900s to the 1960s, especially after the Black-owned Bruce's Beach Resort business and residential community in Manhattan Beach was forced by public power abuse and anti-Black racism in 1924 to close. First made a landmark in 2008, this site was listed as the Bay Street Beach Historic District on the National Register of Historic Places in June 2019 for its significance as a place of African American recreation, relaxation, and civil rights struggles in the United States history. It is the first African American historic district in Santa Monica to receive this national honor. Several of Santa Monica's pioneering African American families, such as the Carters, the Brunsons, Maxwells, the Dumases, the Gabaldons, and others lived on the streets north of Santa Monica High School before the expansion of the campus buildings and Interstate 10 freeway construction razed the neighborhood from the 1930s to the 1960s. A resident of that neighborhood, when he was a toddler, was Nick Gabaldon. And some of you may be familiar that he has become a folk hero as a surfing pioneer of color. My new book examines the local stories of African Americans who fought for equal access to California's recreational and relaxation offerings as they contributed to the broader U.S. freedom rights struggles during the nation's Jim Crow era. They made history in what has been called the frontier of leisure in their attempts to create communities and business projects in conjunction with their growing population in Southern California. Leisure was not an optional add-on to civil rights, but an essential component of liberty. Santa Monica and Manhattan Beach are Los Angeles County coastal communities examined in full chapters of the book. All of the stories of the African American experience I've highlighted today and others are featured in the park's will be featured in the park's outdoor installation. They emanate from my book research and are illustrated in the essay with its 75+ illustrations, and also in the other Belmar History and Art Project components. The stories I unearthed in the book and additional research for the essay are the reasons the Belmar History and Art Project could be done. In closing, the project's broader and innovative ways of sharing untold stories in its multifaceted education, inspirational, and remembrance program tells a more complex American story that will enliven the past in resonating ways for more diverse constituents. The reconstruction of public meanings of Santa Monica's urban landscape amplifies a broader societal understanding of Black life as part of our collective and diverse California cultural heritage to provide broader coastal zone accessibility for present and future generations. The Belmar History and Art programming is an important symbolic action of equity and inclusion for social and environmental justice that recognizes African Americans and other marginalized communities have contributed to making the colorful history of Santa Monica, and that they have a right to historical and cultural sites, along with access to clean air, clean water, and the enjoyment of America's natural and other resources. Thank you very much. I'm handing the reins over to April Banks, artist April Banks, who will talk about her wonderful art piece and the other parts of the program that she helped to develop.
Thank you, Allison. Hello, everyone, and good evening. Thank you for your interest in the Belmar History and Art Project. Going to share my screen. And I just want to confirm that you can see this because I had an issue. Can everyone see my screen? Allison, can you see? I think you're the only one unmuted, but can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So I want to, again, just say thank you for inviting Allison and I to come and talk about this project. We're super excited that we're at the end of about a year and a half for Allison, maybe even longer, but for me, I started in November of last year. And so I'll start with how the project began. So basically 3 phases, the historical research that Allison has done, community engagement, which was a significant part of the beginning of the project, the permanent pieces, which are the outdoor history graphic panels and the art sculpture. And then another key component that we're happy about mostly, well, 2 things. One, it was required, but also in our conversations with community, we came to the understanding of how important this ongoing education piece is. So that is both the curriculum that Allison spoke about, but also programming around the sculpture and the graphics to keep the community engaged with this history. So we're really excited about how this will continue even after the permanent pieces have gone into the site. And as a social practice artist, really it just means that the work that is created comes out of a community process, whether it's co-designing or through conversations or even debate with community. And so I'm going to share some of the community engagement events that we did with the Black Santa Monica community. We began last November with a kickoff breakfast, or maybe it was December. And we just met with key community folks who were curious about the project or had some connection to the neighborhood or the community in some way. And so it was really to introduce everyone to Allison, I, and what the Cultural Affairs Department was hoping to accomplish with this project. We had a series of workshops at different locations. I really felt the best way to reach people is through a variety of art forms, whether it's through movement or through language or any other kind of art form that really helps with the storytelling process or memory. And so we had this poetry workshop at Santa Monica Library that was led by teaching artist Natalie Patterson. Many of you may know Robbie Jones. She's a long-time Santa Monica resident, and she has a Black Santa Monica bus tour looking at several sites around Santa Monica that were significant to Black history. So we were able to join her on one of her tours in January And I personally learned a lot about the sites that she has connections to and memories through her family. We also felt it was really important to try to preserve the stories of community. So we worked with StoryCorps to record some of these oral histories with several pairings of people that were either friends or family members. We had an archive talk also at the library, talking to community with CAROLYNE Edwards, who many of you may know as the newest board member of the Santa Monica Conservancy, and Ariane Edmonds, who is a fifth generation Angelino, and their work around archiving Black history here in the Los Angeles area. So we really talked about the importance of collecting and preserving our stories and our history, whether it's through photographs or ephemera, and how that leads to a written history, and how important it is to preserve these narratives. We also had a community talk and tea at 18th Street Art Center. 18th Street has been very proactive in their mapping and community projects around the Black community and other communities that have been displaced in the Santa Monica area. And then we had a dance workshop at the Greens Festival at Virginia Avenue Park. And again, that was trying to use another art form to talk about displacement and movement and memory and how we hold memories within our body. And two teaching artists, Susu Atara and Natalie Patterson, returned to work with students at Santa Monica High to do a world building workshop where they imagined what Belmar might have been in the future had it not been erased. And this was a really interesting project after speaking to several classes about this history and the fact that it's across the street from their school, and all but one student hadn't even heard of any of this history. So again, I feel super excited that we are including curriculum as a part of this project, and that it will immediately affect the students across, that are in that vicinity across from the project site. So from all of these engagements, we heard all kinds of things. And so as a social practice artist, it is my job, my duty, to take all of these things that come up in conversation and discussion and then make a piece of artwork from it. And so even though I had proposed some general ideas around movement and something kinetic at the field, I didn't know exactly what form it would take. And so what I chose to focus on was these two aspects. One is to remember, and two, to rebuild. I really wanted to honor all of the dreams, the lives, the businesses, the hopes of this community of people with amazing talent and skills, and who had come to this community by the sea, as we, the California dream. And so I really wanted to remember not just the destruction and the loss of this neighborhood, but really celebrate their lives. But I also don't want to gloss over the fact that the land was taken through this eminent domain process, and that there was a spectacle made of the burning and destruction of the houses in this neighborhood. So in the work, I wanted to balance, both the remembrance and acknowledging the destruction. And so that brings me to the work itself, which is called A Resurrection in 4 Stanzas. Based on community conversations, and then that image of the shotgun house, which in early research really just stuck with me. I wanted to, in a symbolic way, rebuild some aspects of this neighborhood, and to do it at a monumental scale. Although the shotgun house itself is not monumental, the artwork is definitely more monumental than what I had originally proposed. And it felt like in the course of what's happening politically around monuments, in the nation, although this conversation started before that. But it just really kind of underscored the need to do something significant and permanent that marked this history in a highly visible way. And so the color red is adding to that. And this is a steel structure made in 4 pieces. And doing the research around shotgun houses, I came across this quote and I thought it was really fitting. The shotgun house has been a signal of difference and perhaps independence. It has been referred to as an architecture of defiance. And architectural historians trace the movement of the shotgun house from the south to the west. And it's believed to have migrated with people who made their migration to the West. And in particular, it's thought of as an African-American architecture form. And so I really felt like as a form, an architecture form, that was a nice metaphor to reinforce this idea that this was a Black community and that this is about transition, whether it's forced or voluntary in migration. So I just wanted to show a few images in the research of shotgun houses. The one on the left is from Alabama, the one on the right is Louisiana. And, you know, they're really simple houses that were typically about 12 feet wide. Sometimes they were a single room and sometimes they were multiple rooms. And the name shotgun house has a few theories, but one is that because there is no hallway and there's a straight opening from the front to the back, that if you shot a gun through, it would go straight through. So that's one theory for the name. Another theory is that it actually comes further back from West Africa and is based on the name shogun, which is a type of house or gathering. So we don't really know the origins of that name, but I think it's a good metaphor for how both space moves and how we bring things with us. And the symbol of the house, to me, just represented the lives and the hopes that people had here. So this is looking at the shotgun sculpture in 4 pieces. I'm not trying to rebuild the whole house, but again, looking at these themes of threshold. So this idea that you're passing through, there's some movement. I really wanted to delineate the house in 2 different ways. If you look at it straight on as a single line, but if you look at it from the side, it has a totally different feel. I thought it was really important to do it at its full scale. And I'm super thankful to Mario Fonda Bonardi and Nina Fresco for sharing with me the drawings of the shotgun house that the Santa Monica Conservancy is in. It just really helped to have all those details to base this work upon. So I'm really grateful for all of the information that was shared. And it was really important to cite this at the original Belmar neighborhood, which is at this new field at 4th and Pico. And I mentioned before the workshop at Santa Monica High, but I think this is a key thing, that it is highly visible from the Santa Monica High field. And other things that I was trying to accomplish with the patterns was this idea of movement, of change. So as the light moves around the sculpture, the feeling of the space in the sculpture is constantly changing. So if I look at a few elements, I wanted to include text, and the shadow of the text again is moving depending on the time of day. This is in prototyping right now with the fabricator, and so I'm just showing an example of some of the testing of the steel that we are doing. And so this is a quote I wrote about the porch. I grew up in the South, and this idea of the front porch is as a place to gather. It's that public place between public and private where community and family often gather. And so the porch itself is a significant part of these kinds of homes in this culture. The door is the place where I wanted to remember that, you know, these structures were often destroyed with fire. And so the pattern is a subtle representation of flames and cracking glass. And in the roof of the house, this quote from Maya Angelou stood out to me early on, and so we have included it. I believe that one can never leave home. I believe that one carries the shadows, the dreams, the fears, and the dragons of home under one's skin, at the extreme corners of one's eyes, and possibly in the gristle of the earlobe. And I just feel like this is a really important way to think about home. And even though the displacement happened, that we still have this history that needs to be told and needs to be remembered. And I'm cutting patterns of photos into the sides through a perforation process. If you're familiar with the bathroom structures at the beach, it's a similar process where the image is a half-tone perforation. And I wanted to honor one of the early families, which is the Brunson family. The window is the fourth piece. And so I just want to quickly show some images of the site. So the historic Belmar Park, which is a new sports field. The work is going to go adjacent to the entrance. And here's a rendering of it on site. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison and April, for that interesting and illustrative presentation. Before I get to the questions, I would like to sort of update the guests on the progress of the Belmar History and Art project. According to my latest information, the signage part of this is now in review at the Coastal Commission, and with hopes that it'll be installed by the first of the year, followed by the art component. And April, you can tell me if that's true or not. That depends on, of course, the pandemic and I suppose the inspection process. So we look forward to following the progress of the project. And now I'm going to ask some questions and see what our audience is interested in. The first question is a thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Can you tell me how, where to access the StoryCorps interviews Ms. Bangs mentioned?
Yes, so they will be on the, at the end of my presentation, I had a link to the Cultural Affairs website. And we're just going through a permissions process right now, but the recordings will be there as a part of the project archive on the Cultural Affairs site.
Great, thank you. This one is from Bonnie. How much autonomy did you have when designing this project? Did you feel like you had free rein to design what you thought made the most impact? Or did the Arts Commission or other city commissions try to steer or shape the project?
Is that a question for?
I guess it's for you. I guess it's for you, and also for Alison. Yes, depending on what you all said, it seems like you did the research, you have the inspiration, and the city just said, "I love you."
So what was required for me was the community engagement process. That was absolutely a requirement. And I set out a proposal of how I would like to do that. There was nothing, no parameters given really. But this is something that I do, so I felt like, you know, I was entrusted with this process. And yeah, at the end of that, I really tried to take in what I heard from the community, what their concerns were, and yeah, had free reign on within budget on what the piece could be, as long as it was within budget and reasonably to be completed within the time frame.
So my work on the project was a little more freeform because of the way in which we started the project. That's not a bad thing, but it just kind of evolved in that way. And so since I had the materials already, more or less, or the research, I was able to suggest the curriculum and put together the essay, which initially it was, oh, provide us with research. And then I was like, well, we might as well put this in some kind of form that it's usable for people. And so that's how that worked out. So I would say that the city, that the representatives of the city that we worked with in cultural affairs, Shannon Doubt and Naomi, oh gosh, I'm like having my moment. Naomi O, I'm having my moment because I'm not looking at her name and I can't say it without looking at it. I'm sorry if you're listening to me, Naomi. But anyway, because I'm a little dyslexic, they were pretty flexible in terms of working with us around the ideas that maybe expanded beyond what they were thinking about initially, because it was the first time they had ever done this kind of project. And so it was a learning process for them as well. They, as I said in my presentation, this is the first time they've ever done an applied history and art project. And so I don't know that they necessarily knew exactly what to do.
Thank goodness you were there. Speaking of the biographical material, there is the family that you mentioned that is being translated onto one of the pieces of the sculpture. Will there be any biographical information about them?
Yes, there will be an artist label that identifies the images, the quotes, a short description of the project, and then online a more in-depth dive into the concept behind the work and also the family. Yeah, and I think there's some, Alison has included, I don't know how in-depth, but some information about the family.
So in my essay, I have a pretty extensive section on the Brunsons because they are one of the families that we actually have a fair amount of information about. That is an early family, and they have been people who have, of Santa Monica, our early African-American family of Santa Monica, and they have been people who have donated some of their family photographs to the museum and to the library. There's other early families that we have information on that I've written about in the essay that will be on the website. Some of those families we don't have pictures of, but I will say also that some of those families are still around the Los Angeles region and they have connection to Santa Monica, even if they're not living in Santa Monica. That's in addition to the Stout family descendants that I spoke about.
Thank you. Here's one from Isabel. Is it typical that freeways got built through communities of color? In the case of Belmar, can you share again the timeline? When was the freeway built and when did the Black families come in? In Venice, I believe the Black families came to work on the oil wells and later the canals. Did the displaced Santa Monica Blacks move to Venice? Actually, what drew the Blacks to this area? What were some of the businesses and attractions?
So as I had said in my narrative, maybe people missed it, but African Americans came to Santa Monica for the same reasons that everybody else came, for the climate and for various life opportunities. There was no industry in Santa Monica at the turn of the century. So people worked in service industries and as domestics. That was, for the most part, African Americans, the employment that they had. There were a few that were small business owners. Professionals couldn't get jobs in Santa Monica until much later in the 20th century. The ministers in Santa Monica, if they were credentialed, that they could have a church and what have you, but in terms of the school system, the police department, the fire department, and some corporations, professionals were not getting employed. As it relates to the Venice community of African Americans started in terms of the larger numbers in the early 20th century, around the same time as Santa Monica, and the two neighborhoods were connected. So they were an African American community of neighborhoods. So the neighborhood in Venice was connected to the neighborhood in Ocean Park, the neighborhood that was in North Santa Monica, the neighborhood at the Belmar area, the neighborhood north of the high school. They were all connected together. There were people that lived in Santa Monica who had relatives that were in Venice, and vice versa. And there, for one person that I talk about in the longer narrative, whose building I showed, Lloyd Allen, when he moved here in 1939, he had relatives that lived in Venice, and he had relatives that lived in Santa Monica. And he told me about living with his brother at 4th and Pico in an apartment building where the Arco station is now, and walking down to visit his other relatives in Venice.
Right.
That was the kind of thing that was going on in terms of the folks. And in terms of African Americans in Venice, I don't know how many of them worked for the oil companies. They were more involved in some of the other businesses down there, in service and with the canals and what have you.
Okay, thank you. This is for April. Ms. Banks, could you talk a bit more about how you came to work on the kind of art that you do, engaging with the public as you do? Was there an experience you had as a young person that inspired you?
That's a great question. So as you mentioned in my bio, I started in architecture, and my thesis project was temporary housing for families, homeless families, mothers with children. And the response I got at my thesis defense was that architecture does not solve social problems. And that was a very long time ago. We obviously have come a long way since then. But it really frustrated me and stuck with me. And I was very disillusioned with architecture from the start. And, you know, that's how I ventured into exhibition design. But I think there was always that belief that, yes, architecture, design, art, all of it can address social problems, social, yeah. So that I think that I can say that was the defining event. And then I've just always sought opportunities where I could use my skill set to help. And so, although this is my first public art commission, I have worked on other civic and civic projects that deal with remembrance and historical preservation.
Thank you. Diane wants to know who provided the funding.
The city of Santa Monica provided the funding. It was percentage for the arts money, and then there was other money that came through Department of Public Works. It's a $500,000 project.
Have you been able to locate any descendants of the Brunson family? And if so, could they be invited to participate in the opening of the sculpture?
So the Brunsons live in Southern California, and few of the relatives still live in Santa Monica. So I'm sure that somebody will come, and yes, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to speak for you on that part, April, but they're around and we know who they are.
Yeah, the challenge at this point is the pandemic. So it's really hard to say what we can do for the opening event. We had planned this big community celebration, but we'll see, you know, by early next year, what's happening and what we are able to do.
This woman, this is from Bonnie. You mentioned working with Carolyn Edwards, the new board member. Welcome. Could you expand on how you used her and her archival work as a resource? Will there be a way to access the information on the website in the future?
You want to answer, Alison, or should I?
So in terms of Carolyn's participation in the project, she did a talk on how she has been engaged with community in terms of encouraging people to preserve their family records. And she gave us some examples of how she's gone about doing that. And so she was sharing with the public on that. She didn't, and she contributed her spirit to what we've been doing, but there was, and she contributed a photograph that's in the exhibition. It's I showed it actually today, the Moore Beauty Shop, and so and also in the narrative that I've written, the essay that will be on the website, I go through a whole section on her and her family. And I have photographs of her mother and father and what have you. In the essay, I talk about her brother's civil rights work, her grandfather's civil rights work. Her grandfather was Reverend Alfred Quinn, and he was a minister of First African Methodist Episcopal Church from the 1930s to the early 1940s. And he went on to, after he left Santa Monica, he went on to found a church in Brawley and a couple of churches in Africa. And he also was the chaplain for the LA County Supervisors and what have you. And her mother, Carolyn's mother, was one of the first African Americans employed in the 1950s at the General Telephone Company.
Oh.
She was employed as an operator, and she went on to have supervisory positions after that. And her uncle, Alfred Quinn, and I get the initials mixed up. Her uncle is Alfred, her grandfather was Alfred too. They have different middle initials and I can't remember right now, but he was the first African-American school teacher in Santa Monica in the mid 1950s. So her spirit is in the project,
Yeah.
And what have you.
Alison, I have a question. Are any of these folks buried at Woodlawn?
Yes. So for instance, Nick Gabaldon.
Oh yeah,
But not just him. His family came here in the 1800s, and most people don't know that. But his mother's family was here, and they were here in the 1890s. His mother was either born in Santa Monica or born in Los Angeles. I can't figure that out. But that family, several of them are buried in Woodlawn, and they stayed in Santa Monica from up until the 1950s when he died and his mother died, and his sister, I think, stayed around, but then she moved. And then the Brunsons, some of them are buried Woodlawn, and some of the other families that I mentioned, some of the Stouts, actually the Stouts are buried there, and then some of their relatives are buried in Woodlawn also.
Okay. Thank you. Somebody mentioned this magical website. So at this point, I want to thank you both for answering the questions and the wonderful questions from our audience. And we're all looking forward to watching the progress of the project as it unfolds. And if you want any more information, I think the easiest way to do is to put in the search words Belmont History plus Art, which leads you to the website, which is full of information, much of what you heard tonight, but more expansive. history, the educational component, background on it, background on these lovely presenters. So I encourage you to do that. And at this point, I'm going to turn the lecture over to Tom Clays, who's going to say a few closing words. Thank you both very much.
Thank you. Can I just say quickly that I added the URL in the Q&A, so I answered that, so you can go directly to
Oh, okay. Thank you. Great. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Allison and April, for your efforts here. It's wonderful. We very much appreciate it. I also want to thank our program committee, every individual on that committee, including Steve Loper, Libby Motika, who you all see here, Allison Knight, and many others. Thank you so much. We couldn't do this work without you. We're largely an all-volunteer organization. We want to again thank Redcar and Jim Jacobson for their sponsorship. And please watch for our next lecture in the series, which is going to occur on December 2nd, and will present a discussion of the Rancho period in Southern California. If you liked what you heard tonight, please share the lecture information with your friends and family. I want to thank those of you who were able to make a donation to the Conservancy in conjunction with this lecture. Because of COVID, we no longer conduct a lot of our events, and we've lost about 70% of our income. So your donation at whatever level will really make a big difference in supporting our important work. To learn more about what we do and join or make a donation, please go to www.smconservancy.org. Thank you.